Thanks to the Asia Society for hosting me today and giving us an opportunity to chat, talk about a few important topics. I think I'll start off by talking a little bit about deterrence in a few remarks here, just to bring everybody back to August of this year. I was in Indonesia actually for an exercise, and it was exercise Super Garuda Shield. It was the first time that Japanese, American, and Indonesian paratroopers actually jumped into an exercise to start a 14-nation exercise coming together. By the way, the year prior, it was just a U.S. Army, Indonesian Army exercise. This past year, 14 nations came together. And the day after the jump was when the PRC and the PLA conducted their, what I would refer to as sort of irresponsible and aggressive acts in and around Taiwan, some of which impacted the economic zones around Japan. So, you know, you see the difference, if you will, in like-minded countries coming together in Indonesia, 14 of them, after really just a short planning timeline to do that, versus the Chinese Communist Party and the PRC and the irresponsible behavior in and around Taiwan and Japan. And I state that because by way of deterrence, I think that our work together with the Japanese and across the region is of significance. And working together allows us to bring what I refer to as a land power network together, because humans have this unique tendency to live on land. And I think what is going on out here is that the PRC is committing a number of acts to violate national sovereignty. And so I think that 14 nations together in an exercise, I'm here today for a couple of reasons. One, we just completed today an exercise called Yamasakura. Yamasakura is, this is actually its 40th year. And I've seen that evolve since I was a major in the late 90s. Came back as a major general, a two-star general, between 14 and 18, and now I'm back as the commanding general of U.S. Army Pacific, and have seen this in 21 and now 22. But I've been watching this since closely since 14. And so just this year, a couple of points about Yamasakura. In this exercise, what you had was the GSO headquarters plane, you had TERCOM playing, you had the GCC, the Ground Component Command. You had two armies playing, the Northern Army and the Western Army. And then, of course, you had every echelon of the U.S. Army playing, from First Corps to sustainment commands. But maybe more importantly, the Australian Army had observers here this year because they intend to send a division next year. And then General Yoshida and myself, who've become very good friends here over the last year and a half, we invited General Bronner, who's the chief of the Philippine Army, here. And so at the same time that this exercise was going on, the Philippine Chief of Army, the Japanese Chief of Army, and myself met. And we intend to train together in exercises in the Philippines, train together here in exercises like Orient Shield, Northwind, and Yamasakura. But maybe more importantly, we all agreed that next year we seek to have a Philippine division participate in Yamasakura. So again, next year, in previous years, we've been just U.S. and Japanese command post exercise. Next year, we'll actually have 4 nations together. And again, I think that network of land power forces, that in this region is actually the security architecture that binds it together. And I think that what I've witnessed in my third tour out here and since my return in 2021 is a strengthening of that land power network with the generals of the land power forces, that being their armies, their Marines, their special operation forces, and of course the ally and partner armies that play such a vital and critical role really in every nation across this region, from South Asia to Southeast Asia to Oceania and to Northeast Asia. I'll just quickly transition to sort of the last point. I think that you know, our goal out here is no war. What we're really trying to do is prevent it. In order to prevent it, you have to train together and you have to have capabilities. And I guess I would describe it, and you know, the Secretary of Defense, our Secretary of Defense, Austin, describes it as integrated deterrence. When I have to communicate that strategic intent to tactical and operational forces, I say it's the sum of these parts: capabilities plus posture plus messaging plus will. So capabilities are the things that we bring to bear as a land power network. Posture is locations, but it's also relationships. It's also in placing material solutions forward so that we can have the access and the presence and the influence as we're working together, training one another. Messaging is actually talking and demonstrating together about what we're doing. Those relationships are incredibly important. And then the will, the fourth component of it is really, I believe that it's best demonstrated by putting your blood and treasure on the ground to protect not just our interests, but to help, in this particular case, protect the interests of Japan. And we have an obligation by way of a treaty and alliance to do that. So the relationships are a critical part of this. I'm extremely proud of what I witnessed here earlier this year during Orient Shield, when we had forces down on Amami Island, and then now here in Yamasakura, particularly as I look to the future and see the evolution and the advance of that particular exercise. So I'll just stop there for the time being and I'll open it up to questions. And again, thanks to the Asia Society. Jesper, thanks to you and the team here for hosting us. And thanks for all of you for coming out today to share some thoughts and provide you any feedback I can on U.S. Army Pacific. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. You talked about alliance building, the evolution of alliance building. Can you describe it in your own career? This is your third tour out here in Asia, if I understand this correctly.
Yes.
Right. Talk to me a little bit also, perhaps at the personal level. How sort of the integration, the alliance building, how that has evolved over the last, particularly 5 or 6 years.
Yeah. I'll tell through a couple of stories. It's probably best to do that. I'll give you a couple. So I have a deputy commander in my headquarters. He's an Australian general. He's a major general. The previous 4 that I've served with, one of them just retired as the chief of the Australian Army. Another one is the second one is currently the commander of their joint operations. The third one is the ambassador to their counterterrorism elements. And so those relationships that were formed through us in an assignment together are invaluable. I'll go to the Philippines. General Bronner, who I mentioned earlier, the current Army chief, the Minister of Defense, Faustino, when I was a division commander in the 25th Division, he was a division commander in the Philippine Army. He's now the Minister of Defense after having been served as the Chief of Army. And then I'll just go over to Thailand. The current Chief of Army there, General Narampong, he and I were operations officers together as majors, and we did an airborne operation in the Philippines during Cobra Gold together. And now we find ourselves years later He's the chief of the Thai Army, and I'm the commander of U.S. Army Pacific. General Apriat, again in Thailand, is a special advisor to the king. He was the former chief of army in Thailand. He was previously also a corps commander when I was a division commander. I guess the point I'm making, Jasper, is Army generals, because armies play such a central role out here in and across Asia, they move to leadership positions within the Army, but also when they leave the Army. And they go into prominent positions throughout their government or throughout their business and their political and diplomatic force. And I think the value of those relationships that are fostered when we're mid-grade officers, senior officers, and general officers, we rely on those. And we rely on those because of our ability to communicate to one another as land commanders. Right. And again, I just think that those types of relationships are very powerful, particularly when there's a crisis. You have the ability to call one another up, and you don't have to, you can immediately get to the heart of the matter. And you're not trying to determine each other's agenda or angle. There's a friendship there, there's a bond there, and then you can immediately get to things like solving problems. And I think that's a really important part of what we're doing here. And it has evolved over years. I guess what I'm saying is, starting in 1997, these things have translated into deep relationships for me 20 years later.
Right. Do you mind sort of bringing the Japanese in, sort of, you know, how you've seen sort of the evolution of the Japanese self-defense forces, their ability to integrate, their ability to communicate?
Yeah.
How?
Yeah, so I'll use Orient Shield and Northwind, two exercises that I did when I was a major. I did one of them in 1997. That was Orient Shield. I did one of them in 1999, Northwind. And then also in 1999, even though I was a major, I came to Yamasakura. Candidly, and I'll use the tactical exercise of Orient Shield, and then I'll say the operational exercise of Yamasakura. The Orient Shield, the training that was going on amongst the two armies, I would say from a proficiency level, we were far more proficient. And that the Japanese army had to make a lot of gains. There was training going on, and it was good training, but the complexity, the scale, and I would say the variables that were being thrown at very tactical formations, I wouldn't say it was very complicated. When I look at that today, it's very different. And I'll take Yamasakura and sort of give you where we are today compared to where we were before. So in my previous assignment, Yamasakura, a command post exercise at the operational level, it had a regional army working in a bilateral command post exercise with one corps headquarters, okay? So today, what we have is a higher command, my theater army, that is stimulating and simulating the ground component command of the Japanese Army against a corps, U.S. Army Corps, First Corps. Then it has two regional armies under the GCC, and then it has 2 or 3 subordinate divisions under that. On the U.S. side, you have the Corps, and then you have 2 U.S. Army divisions, a Marine division, and like I said, next year an Australian division, and a Phil division. So, you know, I'm trying to express to all of you the scale, scope, and complexity of that. And that is just happening in the last 5 to 6 years. So the acceleration, the rate that the Japanese Army is moving at in these very, very demanding and complex command post exercises, where you actually have all your communication systems out, all your networks out. And by the way, this exercise went from the island of Hokkaido all the way down to the Southwest Islands, the geographic span of it. It's also being pushed with simulations that are coming from Korea, Japan, Hawaii, and back in Colorado, and even all the way in the east coast of Rhode Island. So the simulations that are coming to stimulate the exercise are really coming across from 3 countries and 3 continents.
Sounds
Big difference.
Wow. Wow.
And I credit General Yoshida, and I credit the Japanese leadership for pressing and pressing and pressing to want to do more.
Right.
So that's very encouraging, and I'm really excited about what they're doing.
Right.
And what we are all gaining as a result of it.
Right. Right. If you had one wish or one request, you know, to sort of speed up, you know, the presence, those 4 pillars, right, of the overarching deterrence, you know, to guarantee the peace, you know, here in Asia Pacific, you know, what are the, you know, 1 or 2 things that are lacking where you'd like to see more?
I think an increase in the rotational presence of forces throughout the region, staying for a little bit longer in certain locations. Again, I think there's key terrain out there across the region, across Asia and across Southeast Asia, that land forces in those choke points and in that key terrain can play a dominant role in influencing and shaping what's happening.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, I think that some of the things that are happening, I think, across South Asia and Southeast Asia and in Oceania are competition for resources like fresh water and food and minerals. And I think some of that is where land power and land forces coming together can safeguard and protect the people. They can ensure that the national sovereignty is not being violated. I think our presence together as like-minded nations, like I showed an example of 14 or 4 coming together with a common goal. There's an expression of unity and sort of collective commitment by operating together in different exercises and sharing one another's education backgrounds, professional values, the capabilities that we bring to bear with one another, helping to sustain one another's forces as you're operating in and around the region. I think these are all really important illustrations of us working together as a counterweight to some of the destabilizing activities that are occurring in the region.
Right. My final question, and then I want to open it up, and this, you know, if you can divulge, then please, you know, by no means, can you flip that to the evolution of the People's Republic of China, of their military, you know, capabilities, of their ability to communicate amongst themselves, of their command structure, you know, how as a layman, you know, how have you understood, you know, the evolution of that over particularly the last 5 or 6 years? The posturing is obviously clear, right? But in terms of like on the ground as a professional who actually runs the nuts and bolts of this, right? Any insights or any hints you can give us?
Well, I think I would just state it like this: in the 2015, 2016 time frame, they went through an organizational adjustment in their military, and they created what is referred to as theater commands. And then again, just, you know, having been out here for since 14 with really from 18 to 21, I was back in Washington, D.C., but watching this very closely since 14. The combination of the organizational adjustments that they made in the 14-15 time frame added to frankly, the historical arsenal that they have created, that capability, you can never discount. I'm not here to measure their intent. I'm not here to determine, and guess at when they would use that capability. As a military professional, it's my job to pay attention to the capabilities that they have. And so when I see the organizational adjustments coupled to the arsenal that they have built, I have an obligation, I have a responsibility as a commander to plan against that. So in my view, that's what's most concerning, is the fact that you make organizational adjustments, you create an arsenal of that size, and then you begin to train and do things with that arsenal and those new organizations. And to me, that is a very concerning, and we should all be concerned about the behavior and the aggressive nature by which some of their operations have been conducted. And as I mentioned earlier, in August, I'm in Indonesia with 14 countries, one of them being Japan. The day after, you all know what they did. So that kind of irresponsible behavior, we should all condemn.
Yep. I'd like to open it up for a question from Jerry.
Thank you. First, General, thank you for all your service, and thank you all for all your service. I wanted to build upon the China question. In 2011, after the earthquake and tsunami, we had a lot of help from the U.S. on the rebuilding, and I was engaged in a long discussion with a senior military official, and on the topic of China. This was 2011, so maybe it's changed. The number one concern was about the quality of the chain of command due to corruption. You know, he was citing specific price points for a general or a captain or major positions to be bought. And have you seen any changes in that? Have they strengthened? And I mean, at that time, another concern was a civilian control over the military, which seems to have resolved itself over the last 12 years or so. But in terms of quality of change of command and the possibility of miscalculation because of a poor chain of command, what are the concerns in this area?
Thanks, Jerry, for the question. Let me come back to two things, and then I'm going to tie it together with my my thought on what you've just asked me. First of all, the organizational adjustments that they made in the 14, 15, 16 timeframe were not insignificant. Secondly, as I talked about the arsenal that they've created, I think the other thing that is telling here, and this isn't about any specific leader themselves, but I'm getting at the point of military proficiency through training. So the training that they were doing in the 13, 14, 15 time frame is very different from the training that they're doing today, which tells me there's a certain professionalization that's been ongoing. And again, if I tie all three of those together, organizational adjustments, capability development, and then professionalization in training. Again, that is another indicator to me that some of those leaders are growing up through that system. And so there's a degree of competency and proficiency that is being increased just by virtue of that training. Now, we could talk cultural and all those types of things. That's for somebody else to probably debate whether how rigorous and the output of it. But again, when I look at all three of those, this is something that is obviously concerning.
Thank you. My name is Takehito. I took a ROTC class in the United States as a U.S. Japanese citizenship.
So
it was a great experience to learn. My question will be about the education. I'm a social scientist in higher education. You mentioned about land power network or alliance significance. If we want to provide more extensive opportunities for National Defense Academy, West Point, Annapolis, or Colorado Springs, in that generation, emerging cadet or officers, what kind of skill they should acquire to prepare for multinational network alliance?
Yeah, so one of the most powerful tools that we use across the region is our individual military education training, IMET. Actually, we work The Department of Defense works very closely with the Department of State. This is actually a Department of State program, but we then open up those seats in our education, professional education, both on the non-commissioned officer side and on the officer side. Two things I'd mention. One, and General Yoshida and I just talked about this in this training exercise, the non-commissioned officers in the U.S. military, they literally are the backbone of our force. And after the Vietnam War, we always had a professional education system. But when the U.S. Army went from a draft force to a volunteer force, there was a quick recognition that you needed a professional education system for the non-commissioned officers. So one area that I think that a number of armies in the region should strongly consider, and this includes Japan, is how do you educate your non-commissioned officers? Because there has to be some formal education system built into your non-commissioned officer corps to reward and incentivize their professional growth. On the officer side, we continue to open up not just academies or college seats for them, but I think it's really powerful to go to 1- and 2-week courses. We have land component courses. We have northern warfare courses in Alaska. We have jungle operations courses in Hawaii, and there are countless other small unit, short duration, skill proficiency courses that are also very helpful, in addition to academies and colleges or command and general staff colleges for mid-grade and senior officers. So I think the combined effects of those, sir, are probably the best way to infuse and professionalize and educate the force for the future. Because really, what you're really doing is building leaders to have those tactical, operational, and strategic insights so that in the future they can become leaders of large organizations with complex problems.
Todd Geil, thank you for joining us today. My question is one step short of a hot war question, and it has to do with the potentials for a blockade of some kind. And you talked about capabilities, and my question is, if you combine the capabilities of the 4 and the 14 and think about, the political and military coordination that those bring about, in the event of some kind of a blockade or a constraint to trade, how does that new multilateral set of organizations work with business or with countries involved to deal with some of the constraints that a blockade would bring about in trade and operations? Thank you.
I don't want to get mired, Todd, in a policy response. I guess what I would say to you is the exercise that we're doing right now, just finished today, Yamasakura, the complexity and the scale of the scenario creates an opportunity for military leaders from multiple countries to be confronted with a challenging scenario so that we can think, plan, integrate, synchronize, and coordinate our responsibilities because of the capabilities that the military brings, so that we can provide options to our political leaders regardless of the country. This is why we do very complex command post exercises. And we don't know all the answers. But the thinking, the innovation, the teamwork, the collaboration that goes on in these large exercises like that, they give us a platform that together we can think through very complex operations and develop a range of options so that we can go in front of our political leaders and allow them the opportunity to select from those options and then apply whatever tool within the security toolkit that they want to apply. I think that's the value of what we're doing, is training with the military arm of diplomatic, information, military, and economic, so that we can go back to our civilian leaders and give them options.
General, thank you very much. Robert Dezeric. I have a question. You mentioned that one of your deputy commanding generals is from the Australian Army. Do you see a point where a Japanese ground self-defense officer, general officer, could be on your staff?
Well, I have an LNO in my headquarters right now, a lieutenant colonel. But yes, I do at some point. I don't know exactly when. Of course, the minute I ask for a general officer from the Japanese Army on my staff, they're going to want an American officer on their staff too. So, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I do think that we're seeing more and more of this. I'll give you an example. This is the fifth two-star general that we've had from the Australian Army on my staff. The U.S. division in Hawaii, the 25th Division, has a deputy commander who's a New Zealand officer. And then we have a host of LNOs that are in my headquarters, one from Japan. So I think there's more of that going on now. In fact, just this year, we brought on a UK LNO into our headquarters. In fact, he's in the same directorate as the Japanese LNO. So these are all very positive indicators, in my view, of this exchange of officers and the professional insights and sort of the shared commitment, if you will, to addressing the problems and challenges that we do have here as a result of China.
Dovetailing onto that, can you talk a little bit about India? You talked about Indonesia, that the integration there, where does India fit? Because it's obviously, one of the Quad, at the high political level, that's, probably the key development that has happened. What about the relationship with India?
Well, I'll speak about the U.S. Army relationship.
Yep.
I visited there in June. Next month, within 60 days, we have our annual land forces talks. We just finished an exercise with the 11th Airborne Division, which is based in Alaska, but part of my command at 10,000 feet in the Himalayas. There's some really, I think, some great work going on between at least the U.S. Army and the Indian Army. As many of you know, or maybe you don't realize, that 80% of the Indian military is the Army. And so their Army and our U.S. Army, we have an exercise called Yudh-Abhyas, which is an annual exercise. One year we do it in India. Next year we do it in the States. Next year we'll do it in Alaska. Again, trying to bring our high altitude, mountain, extreme cold weather forces together, because there's a lot that we can learn from them, and my hope is also that we can also pass some things on to their forces. One other thing, in September of 23, very excited about this, we do an annual Indo-Pacific Army Chiefs Conference in the region. This last year we did it in Bangladesh. India recently accepted to do that conference this year in Delhi in September of 23. So again, to me, it's another illustration of the close working relationship that we're building and fostering.
Thank you very much, General Flynn. It was wonderful to see you. And my question is Army modernization of Japan and the United States. And when I was, my last command was to be in charge of modernization. So I used to commute to General Dubik, 25th Division Commander and First Corps Commander, and afterwards, like General Isobe, he came to IS as a mentor.
Right.
And every time, every opportunity I took to learn how U.S. Army modernized. And we learned a lot. And when just before my retirement, we started the test bed using second division in Hokkaido. And maybe direction the same as the U.S. Army had been doing. And my question is, how is it going in the U.S. side? How do you see Japanese modernization, particularly in command and control systems?
Yeah. Thanks. Sort of two-part response. The first part is, so recently, in the last 4 years, the U.S. Army has stood up U.S. Army Futures Command. And Futures Command was really a recognition or maybe a institutional criticism that we really didn't have a commander in charge of the modernization efforts of the U.S. Army. Tied together with the creation of a four-star command to lead the efforts of modernization, the Army selected 6 modernization priorities because we had to prioritize our investments, like any organization needs to. That command and those 6 modernization priorities: long-range precision fires, integrated air missile defense, network modernization, soldier lethality, next-gen ground combat vehicle, and future vertical lift. Those remain. And I think that a commander and priorities that have been consistent have been very helpful in us identifying the capabilities that we need for the future, but also, maybe more importantly, is taking legacy capabilities that we know we don't need and not making continued investments into those. I think there's a road to march here that we're still on. It's still a journey for us, but I'm very confident that the command, the priorities, and the doctrine that we've just recently published with multi-domain operations is helping us a great deal in being able to sort of see the future and drive the organizations into that future. As it relates to Japan, General Yoshida has been, in my view, has a great vision and is very interested in the force employment of the Japanese Army, the force development, which kind of happens in the middle, and then the force design of the future. And on a visit that he made back to the United States to see the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, General McConville, we had him go to Fort Bragg to see the advancements being made by Special Operations Command. I had him go to Huntsville, Alabama to see our Rapid Capabilities Test Organization. He went to Austin, Texas and visited our Army Futures Command. And then, of course, he went to Joint Base Lewis McChord, which is in my command, and visited Multi-Domain Task Force, the 5th Security Force Assistance Brigade, and the hypersonic batteries, long-range precision batteries, and the other long-range fires organizations that are at Joint Base Lewis McChord on the West Coast. So that investment of his time to see the manifestation of that modernization and those efforts, I think speaks volumes about where his intellectual thought and vision is for the future of the Japanese military.
Thank you very much for your time. My name is Noah Snyder. I wanted to ask, there have been a number of ongoing big shifts in Japanese defense policy happening this year, both in terms of spending levels, capabilities, and kind of strategic vision. From your perspective, what impact are those going to have on the U.S. Japan Alliance?
Well, I think related to the earlier question, I mean, I would just express it this way, that there are investment decisions that they'll need to make. I think as they study what capabilities that their current force has and those capabilities that they want to maintain and potentially upgrade a bit, that is one investment decision. The second one is also like, what are the investment decisions they want to make on future capabilities? Because some of those are going to take some time for it to develop. The other aspect that I'll mention here is, just 5 years ago, they stood up their Ground Component Command. So again, an organizational change that was made. And I think one of the things that I continue to learn through my own, education and professional development, even as a senior officer, it's important to maintain your intellectual curiosity. The organizational adjustments that are made, they may be actually more important than the hardware and software investments that you make. And I'll give you an example. The multi-domain task force that the U.S. Army has, in fact, I have 2 in my command. This was an organizational adjustment that came out of some testing and some experiments that were done as far back as 2012. We were having difficulty understanding, where does this organization fit in, at what echelon? What is its roles and functions? How many people are in it? How do you organize it? What are the processes and procedures that organization needs to perform? In 2019, we made a decision to, the then Secretary of the Army and Chief of Staff of the Army made a decision to say, hey, we're going to put a 1-star general in charge of it, go put it out at Joint Base Lewis-McChord, and candidly, we weren't exactly sure if that organization was right. Today, that organization has an incredibly dominant role, an important role in our efforts here across Asia and in the Pacific. And it is essentially going to bring together all of the advanced capabilities and weaponry that we are creating through our modernization efforts. And that organization was out in front of the delivery of actually the hardware. And I think that that is an important point, that we often put hardware in the hands of a legacy organization and they don't know what to do with it. And so what we've done now is we put the organization actually in front of the hardware that will show up. And so that organization had 2 or 3 years to work through all of the human, technical, and procedural interoperability aspects, so that when the new capabilities arrive, they can immediately begin to employ those systems. I hope that answers your question. That's a story that's actually not normally told about our modernization efforts, but I think it's an important one because the organization has actually been leading the modernization efforts, but it gets probably very little press. Everybody will talk about the hardware, but it's really the leaders in the organization that are making the greatest difference.
I think there is one question from the online audience.
Yes, we have a question from Tomohiko Taniguchi-san, who is the late Prime Minister Abe's speechwriter. He asks, the late Prime Minister Abe made it possible for the Japanese forces to work as a collective unit with Americans and possibly with other like-minded partners, such as Australia. How much faith could you put on that arrangement? And if we were to get involved in cumbersome political process, if in case of a real confrontations, what would be the most necessary for Japan and the U.S. to give the most powerful signal towards Beijing as regards to the combined deterrence capabilities?
Again, I'll tell a story to highlight sort of the network of leaders across the land power network that are doing really the work that Prime Minister Abe started. So the reason that the Japan, U.S., and Phil trilat happened just yesterday here in Japan was because General Yoshida went to that exercise in Indonesia, and then he went to Australia for another trilat. The trilat in Australia was between Japan, the U.S., Australia, and we've always invited South Korea and India. India did not send a representative that year, but the South Korean Chief of Army came. At that trilat, that was when General Yoshida told me, General Bronner from the Philippines came to see me, and he wants to meet with you and me in Yamasakura later this year. So that's what I think Prime Minister Abe started. And that's where this network of Army leaders like General Stewart in Australia, General Bronner in the Philippines, General Yoshida here in Japan, myself as the U.S. Army Pacific Commander, and countless other land force commanders across the region coming together as like-minded leaders from like-minded nations that are trying to find opportunities for our soldiers and our forces and our capabilities and our posture and our messaging and will to work together and stand together, even amongst some of the irresponsible and insidious behavior that's happening across the region, where it does create and has destabilizing effects. So I'm encouraged by it because, Jesper, to a question you asked me earlier, actually what I sensed on my third tour back here in the region in June of 21 was, and this was just as we were breaking out of 2+ years of COVID, there was a real thirst to get back together by all of the leaders. And then once we sort of, transportation began to open up, countries began to open up, and then exercises began to, go back to their, I'll say, pre-COVID days, the leaders rallied around one another. And almost near simultaneous with that was, again, what we just witnessed here earlier this year by the PRC. And so I think those things coupled together have created conditions where the leaders are seeking opportunities to work together and create additional chances for our junior leaders, our mid-grade leaders, and our senior leaders to come together, to train together, to educate together, and to learn from one another. And at the end of the day, from all of that comes a degree of trust that you only create by being together under some shared experiences and some shared hardships. And that's where I really think the unity and collective commitment comes together as a group of military professionals with a common goal and a common aim.
Right. We've got time for one more question. I'm going to exercise that, right, and do a complete pivot. Unfortunately, there's a war going on in Europe. As an army leader, as the leader of the army, the war's been going on since the beginning of this year. Any insights about strategy, about tactics, about gear, about, that have surprised you or have surprised the army, or any lessons that are relevant here for your command in Asia-Pacific?
Yeah, a couple thoughts come to mind. First of all, I think you're seeing that U.S. equipment is very good. It works. It works, and it works well. The second thought that comes to mind is that there's an old saying, amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. I think operational endurance is really is an important element of what, at the operational level and at the theater strategic level of war, you have to create conditions for operational endurance because of human interactions, war is the most unpredictable. And then my last thought on what's actually happening, and it's terrible, the wreckage and the carnage that's happening in Europe. But for those that think war is going to be short and sharp, you should think again. War is unpredictable. It's long and always longer than we think. It's very violent and it's very human. And I think that that's what is playing out in Europe right now. And so as a military professional, as a school-trained strategic planner, and somebody who's spent nearly 4 decades doing nothing but thinking about war, I think it's something we should all strive to avoid. However, don't think for a minute that it can't come, because it can. And so our job, at least wearing a uniform, is to prepare for that so that it doesn't come. Because through that preparation, we can prevent it from coming.
General, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope everybody enjoyed this. I'm sure there's room for many more questions, but in the interest of time, you've got to rush off and preserve the peace.
You have to catch a plane tonight.
Good. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, everybody.